Yeah, clothing. Right.
Great, let me get my slides queued up here. I'm getting a message that the participant screen sharing is disabled.
Oh, let me see what I can do about that. Okay. Says that you should be allowed to. Let me make sure I've made you co-host. Oh, the co-host came off. Okay. See
Great, thank
if it
you.
works now. Okay.
Thank you for having me here today this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation plan that TLC completed for the Rocky and Deep Rivers that run in Chatham and Lee County, and sort of the way that we incorporated GIS and community engagement together to achieve the goals of this plan. If you have questions at any point, please feel free to stop me. This does not need to be super formal. But just to give a little bit of background, I know TLC has been part of this coalition, so most of you are probably aware, but we are an accredited land trust that work in 6 different counties throughout the triangle that you can see on this map here to the right. We've conserved over 25,000 acres of land since we began about 40 years ago and have over 8 nature preserves that we own and operate for the public, in addition to many other partner projects. I have our mission statement listed on the left here just to really highlight that catalyzing community action and that sort of collaboration piece are intrinsic in what we do, and we try to bring that to all of our projects. I don't think there's really anything we've been able to accomplish alone in the area, and so this is really an important part of where we're trying to go in the next 5 years or so and has been a part of our past as well. And so some of the key tools we use to do this work involve land protection tools like land acquisition or easement acquisition to try to protect land. But we're also kind of looking at all of our work through the lens of these 4 public benefits, one of them being connecting people in nature. And so a lot of our projects where we go to screen and see if they're going to be a good fit for us, they have to sort of pass one of these or hopefully more of just one key public benefit. And so the plan that we were working on in Chatham and Lee, we sort of analyzed everything in terms of these 4 public benefits. And so it's something to keep in mind as I go throughout the presentation today. So just to give you a brief idea of the timeline, we began this last September 2023 by setting sort of the scope of where we wanted to look, identifying key stakeholders in the region, sort of GIS data sets we could maybe use to help inform our priorities there, and developing our community outreach pieces, which for this project looked like an interview with key stakeholders as well as a survey that we could get from feedback from a wider cross-section of the community. So in October, we began to conduct those interviews, sort of transcribe and analyze the key themes in them, create models that complemented them in GIS. And then in November, we were able to put out that community survey and collect those responses to sort of refine our priorities, and then put all of that together in a sort of rough draft. We worked with a local designer to come up with a sort of refined, kind of polished product that we could put out to the community and share with them in a sort of community style event where we were trying to bring people together and gain support for the plan. And so I'd like to just begin to introduce the project by introducing the study area where we were focusing for this project specifically. If you're unfamiliar with the Chatham and Lee area, these are the Rocky and Deep Rivers that run through those parts of the county. They do extend into other counties as well, but because they were outside of TLC's service area, we chose not to focus in those specific areas. The Deep River actually sort of forms the county border between Chatham and Lee. And so I don't know if you can see my cursor when I move it around, but everything up here is sort of Chatham County, everything down here is Lee. You can see we have several major cities in the area, as well as places that are a little bit more vulnerable to change, as well as like economic growth in the area, especially around Siler City and places in Sanford. And what this map shows you is other entities that are conservation minded working in the region. And so you can see we have state parks has a pretty strong foothold here, especially with Jordan Lake. They own significant land around Jordan Lake, as well as Wildlife Resource Commission. Some of these projects are TLC funded projects. So if you've ever been to White Pines Nature Preserve or know where that is, it sort of sits at the confluence of these 2 rivers here. And we have other partners both at the town level and the state. And so we wanted to see sort of who's in the region, who we can collaborate with. We don't want to double down on effort if it's already being done by one of our partners. And so that was a key first step. And then another thing you'll notice here, just to call your attention to, is all of this land in gold is private conservation. So there are folks that have a little more capacity than the rest of us, but hold land for the purpose of conservation, but do not currently have permanent protections in place. So if they were to sell that land, there's nothing stopping someone else from coming in and sort of, bulldozing it and creating whatever they want. So these are sort of partnerships that we work with in trust and hope, that they will fruit into something more permanent later. But one of the key goals of this plan was to sort of look at this land and think about what we could use it for, because right now it's just sitting and we're not letting people onto it, and it's not being used, I think, in its best. It's not being used to its fullest capacity. So this was a big challenge for this project as well. So the next piece of this was sort of going to our partners and seeing what they saw in the region, and just kind of asking what they would like for the area and what they saw moving forward and the challenges they've identified as working. So all of those people we identified on our last map, what did they have to say? And so for this, we conducted interviews. We talked to about 13 different individuals at 8 organizations that sort of represented a cross-section of the city and state level, working specifically in land conservation, less with community programming. But you can see here we talked to members of Fish and Wildlife, state parks, folks in both of the county parks and recreation departments, as well as some community members and key stakeholders that work closely with us on other projects as well. And what we were really trying to hone in on here was where the internal strategic priorities of these organizations were, to see if there were overlap with ours or places maybe we could add capacity where they weren't already working. To see the internal capacity of those organizations as well, whether they were looking to take on more land management in the future or if they were already sort of at capacity with what they were holding in the area, the challenges they anticipated for the future, and sort of their desired vision for the area as a whole. And so the key themes we sort of took away from these interviews were that everyone sort of valued these resources highly. And that may sound unsurprising for an area where we were choosing to focus our project, but the 2 rivers that run through these counties are some of the key resources for the counties. And, Durham and Raleigh and Chapel Hill were blessed with a lot of wonderful natural resources, but for these communities especially, these 2 rivers are incredibly important. We also heard that this was the right time to be planning. There's a lot of huge development projects coming into the area, and, sort of controversial projects like Chatham Park and some of the large sort of plants coming in. And so they were hoping that, thinking about planning now and working with these organizations and not necessarily fighting them is sort of the better opportunity to move forward in the future. And with that comes a lot of a need for extra capacity. So most of our conservation organizations are sort of working at the upper end of what they can achieve right now with the amount of funding and staff they have available. And so that was a big need that almost all of our partners identified. And then when speaking to them, we also found that they were really hoping for a collaborative approach. Sometimes I think we can understand that resources being disseminated either from the state or from the federal government don't always get distributed equally. And we were really heard from our partners that they were hoping collaboration where resources are spread around equally and capacity is spread around equally was something that most people wanted to see in this area. From the community survey, we received about 74 responses in just under 2 weeks. We got really high, great feedback in terms of how important these rivers are for people's livelihoods. There was a lot of recreators that responded to us, community members in the counties or surrounding cities that really wanted to see more from the rivers, either more opportunities for recreation, or were very concerned about how the incoming development was going to affect water quality and made that known. And so just some of the key questions I put on here to sort of summarize that were people answering that they didn't feel that there was enough work being done to actually protect these habitats and the water quality. They didn't feel that they were protected, into the future. And they would like to see more conservation efforts from organizations like ours working around the river. And now one thing I will mention is I think that it's hard sometimes to reach the broadest cross-section of the community when you think about where TLC usually partners. Sometimes we have the same sort of people responding to our messaging in our surveys. And so I think one thing we could do in the future better is sort of think about how we disseminate these information to people and like who we're actually reaching versus who we think we're reaching. Unfortunately, for the timeline we were working on and the capacity of one working on this project, that was a little bit outside the scope of where we could do this, but I think that's something to think about in the future. So that's our community piece. And now the question is, what additional information can spatial data sort of tell us where community outreach cannot, or where when we blend the two together, we get more of a full picture for this area? And so before I go into the specifics of that, I just want to give a sort of high-level overview for people who are not familiar with GIS, what this sort of workflow looks like. The specifics aren't important, but basically GIS gives you the ability to look down on a bird's eye level of a landscape in a really sort of unbiased way, because you get data on about like a 30 by 30 meter basis for almost anything you can imagine. And so we have information about where maybe rare species have been seen in the past, or places where forests are really great and intact, places where they're maybe necessarily not. We can look at places where slopes are really steep, where you might want to, conserve that in a more natural landscape than have a lot of water rushing into the rivers. And so we have all this environmental data online. And basically the process you use to make it intelligible for this project would be to transform a raw data value into something like a ranked score. So for example, I have on here places that we've noted are resilient. We can call them, give them a score arbitrarily of like 100, and places that are not, so maybe think about like paved roads or subdivisions, we would give those a lower score, like 1. And then what you do is you come up with all the data sources that you want to use for your project. So maybe data about species, about water, and then you combine them in sort of like a stack, like a calculator, and assign different weights to the layers. So here you can see maybe this particular data layer is more important and it's gonna get a score of 25 than the one above it, which would be 10. And so another key aspect where community involvement can come into play is sort of deciding what these priorities are, because calculators just tell us what we put into them, right? So we need to make sure that we're getting the best available expertise and information to sort of put into that, so that when we get our overall model value, it's informed by something other than just me behind a computer deciding weights. And so one of the ways you can do that when you poll a community is to basically just ask. And so this is another example. I co-opted this from a training I took on how to do conservation plans. But if you were to pose these sort of questions to the public, which we did in terms of like, what's your most important, how would you rank all of these possible benefits of conservation? Say maybe in our options list here, option 1 is protecting natural habitats. Option 2 would be protecting, small tributaries that flow into the rivers, making sure that we have recreation opportunities, or possibly generating income from recreational opportunities. And so you list out all your possible options for ways you can prioritize a project, because there really are infinite ways that you can look at these conservation projects and the benefits that they have for the community. And so the respondents would then answer, low, medium, or high, or you can change these. You can make them, you could do 5 scales, you could do 3, you could do 10, you can make it as complicated as you'd like. But you sort of pose the question to them, and then what you get back is information you can transform into numbers. And so let's say up top, we have our respondents is A, B, C, D, just, number of people, and you have all the possible options for conservation prioritizations they can choose from. You could assign, a value that's, if they indicate it's a high priority, you could assign it a 3, if it's a medium priority, a 2. And so what you see here is a sort of matrix of numbers, and all it indicates is people's desire transformed into numbers. And then if you do some simple math on that, like the total number of votes over the total number of answers, you can get weights. And so if none of that made sense and I went through it too quickly, all you need to know is that these weights here can help you correspond and choose the actual weights of your data layers. And so what you get in this overall model score is something informed by science, but also directed by your community, where you know that they've had input, and these darker places here correspond to areas where you might want to focus your conservation projects, because it's going to help achieve the aims that your community wants, as well as delineated sort of by our best scientific data. And so some of the results we got when we did this, were maps basically that showed us in a type of blueprint where we should be focusing our efforts. And so I included one here for habitat priorities. We also made one for clean water, for protecting local farms and food, and connecting people to nature, because as I mentioned earlier, those are TLCs for public benefits. And so we like to sort of separate those out. There's a lot of different information that goes into each one of those, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to overlay habitat priorities with farming priorities. They don't always go together. So what you see here on this map is basically what I said earlier. Darker green places show you areas where the habitat quality is high, as defined by what the community finds most important. And so what we found was that the land within these river corridors, which we described, I think, is about 1.5 miles around each side of the river, scored on average 2 times higher for prime habitats than the rest of the counties, the land in the counties. So these really are biodiversity hotspots for the county, and sort of this data helped us confirm that numerically. Also, the brown land on here are places we've already conserved permanently. So you can see a lot of this land in the middle here that lights up dark green is actually part of that private conservation, which is good, but obviously we'd like to then convert that into a more permanent protection. And so what I did here was sort of draw boundaries around each of those habitat priority areas where we had those dark green pixels that showed us really important places, and took it a sort of step further by working with our partners. I knew where along this landscape they'd like to focus. So for example, the land I have drawn out here in, I'll say blob C, because it doesn't really resemble anything but a blob, is land that I know State Parks is really interested in because they have footholds here already. There's places they can easily expand. They're also doing a lot of restoration on these lands to open them up to the public. And so they indicated to me that anything sort of around the confluence of these two rivers would be like something they would really like to take on. But if you moved up sort of the Rocky here, they were less interested in these pieces because they were further away. And so this is how we tried to incorporate management considerations in these areas, because sometimes the best available land to conserve for, say, habitats isn't one anyone wants to take on. It can take a lot of time and money to protect these things, and you have to deal with the blowback of community issues, you know, running bathrooms and emptying trash cans and all the things that come when you open up parks to people. And so one of the findings we had here was that all of this land in Group B that's, you know, pretty high quality habitat, it's not currently being used for recreation, might be a good fit for, say, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who's interested in opening more urban nature preserves. And so we actually, in our meeting with them, sort of floated this idea, and they were pretty positively responsive to it. Obviously, that sort of change takes a lot of time at the federal level, but having a project like this and sort of delineating it on a map and confirming it with all of these analyses really helps them take the next step to then use it to advocate for potentially a new park in this region. And so these are sort of how GIS and the management considerations can come together and give you a type of roadmap about where you're working in the area and who you should be approaching when you're considering a new project. So this is just sort of an idea of where we are in the region. There's around 5,000 acres of land protected along these two rivers right now, about another 2,000 acres of that under easement, so we don't own it, or a conservation organization doesn't own it, but our partners in the community do. And we have over like 3 dedicated nature preserves, projects funded by the state. What I really wanted to highlight on here is this 8,000 acres of privately conserved land with no permanent protection. It's that gold area I mentioned earlier. And it's the place we're really trying to advocate for, say, like a new federal park to come in and a new partner to sort of work in this area. And then sort of wrapping this up, this is our process. We wanted to present this results to the community and sort of show them the work that's going on behind the scenes, because they don't always get to be in those conversations and sort of hear the way people are planning in their own region. And so we threw sort of like a fun after work kind of event local in Sanford so that they didn't have to drive all the way up to Durham. So we had sort of like a conservation happy hour for them where we presented these maps and talked about just the rivers and people's really like love for them and what they wanted to see in the area. And so we had about 50 attendees. These are just some pictures of my colleagues and people that joined, but you can see sort of the information we shared with them. And it was pretty successful. We actually had a lot of folks contact my colleagues later and talk about conservation options for their properties or ways they can get more involved. And so the contacts we made, by going to the community and sort of engaging with them in this work have already been paying off over the next year. And we also created a big old report that I'm sure everyone loves reading 30-page reports. But we had grant money to sort of put this into a nice form, and we worked with a designer, and so this report was about February of this year. It's available on TLC's website if anyone wants to learn more. We also have like a summary 4-page of the results that are a little more palatable if you have less time. That is on our website as well. So I can drop the link to that in the chat. Yeah, that's about all that's my last slide. All I wanted to share. I know I went through that a little bit fast. Everyone's level of understanding, I think, is different when we come into meetings like this. So if anyone has questions for me, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them.
Chloe, this is Maggie from We Plan It Forward. I think the question I had was, in the very beginning, you talked about wanting to do a different job on reaching out to the community. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So when we were thinking about how to put out the survey, firstly, we made it over the internet. So like Microsoft Forms was the platform we used. So that already precludes people, I think, who aren't as comfortable on a computer, some older folks, which are a huge basis of our supporters at TLC as well. And then thinking about how you get that link out to people. So we put it in like the TLC newsletters. We sent it to our partners, hoping that they would push it to community members as well. But a lot of that relies on those connections and the collaboration to be there. And so I was thinking that it might be possible we missed people who are not as involved in, say, recreation, or TLC doesn't like have any name recognition for them, or maybe they're not even involved in their local government and don't sort of keep up to date with the information coming in that way. So I was a little bit concerned just based on all of the responses we were getting were incredibly positive, and I was wondering maybe if there were some people who don't necessarily feel that way about conservation and we were sort of missing them. Another big thing I was concerned with that I didn't have the resources to address now is that there are communities in Siler City who we know are like maybe predominantly not English, like as a first language speaking, and I do not have the ability to translate into Spanish well. And so I was concerned that maybe when we're thinking about community outreach, sort of looking a little bit deeper into the demographics of who in the cities we were trying to reach, and whether this platform was really the best for them or if it was just what was easiest for me to put together. So those are just recommendations I think moving forward on future projects I would like to take a little bit more time to delve into. This was my first like full plan with TLC, so there were some learning curves for me too, and I think that's one thing I took away from it that I would encourage other people to look at more.
Great. Yeah, I think the other thing to think about is just sort of your non-traditional partners, like churches and even grocery stores and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we were a little bit limited in time, unfortunately. I think with more time you can really like explore more of those non-traditional avenues. I definitely agree. I think that was one piece of this I wish we would have, spent a few more months on, like trying to come up with a strategy for how to push it out versus just doing our usual, which is like traditional partners and email lists and that sort of thing.
Right. It sounds like a great learning experience though. Yeah.
And a beautiful product.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. I'm a map nerd, so it's cool to look at some of those. I'm wondering, do you just have like, that's a lot of detail. Does TLC just have that detail for that section of the triangle, or have you all done similar work on the other rivers that intersect with your project, with your areas?
Yeah, this sort of like GIS mapping technique is called a prioritization model, is sort of like the way we talk about it in the GIS world. And TLC has different versions for the places we work, sort of informed by what our priorities in those areas are. Because this one was a partner project, we wanted to make sure we got that voice of the community and our partners into the GIS like rating and weighting schemes. But internally, we also use very similar tools in our other counties. So they're currently doing one for the entire county of Johnston, sort of in a partnership effort with Parks and Rec. But I know we have similar all county sort of assessments, and they're all on that like 30 by 30 pixel meter basis. So we do have a lot of this data. We don't publish that as widely just because I think some people can get kind of hairy seeing their place on a map. But we do
Yeah.
use this to make internal decisions.
Cool.
Okay, any other questions?
I have one. What was can you share what was the amount of the grant that supported this work?
It is a great question. I believe it was around $20,000 from, it was a partnership grant administered. The funds originally came from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As I mentioned, they were really interested in this area in general to see what the feasibility of working is and like where the partners were and whether or not they'd be sort of like a welcome addition. That was funneled through the Conservation Fund, so they also had money to do some of their own assessments, and then they partnered with us. So that's the portion we got. And that helped fund my staff time as well as some of the designer fees we used to put out the publication materials.
Thanks.
This is Dale. Chloe, this is lovely, very lovely. I've got family down in that part of the state, and I'd love to send them this report or case study. Is that I looked up on TLC, I couldn't find it. Is it available yet? Or
It's
will
probably
it be
because our
available?
website's a little messy. I can definitely drop the link in right now.
Oh, great, thanks.
Yeah, they are both available online.
I guess the other question I had, Chloe, is to the extent farmers were involved, the Chatham County farmers whose land borders these areas, go up against the Rocky River or the Deep River.
Yeah, we have some good partners in the area, people we've worked with. Some of the projects that I showed on our initial study area are farmers that we've worked with to put conservation easements on their property. Chatham has a really robust farming community that I think TLC has a very good relationship with. And so they work with us all the time. And some of the ways we can learn about what makes a good farm project is from them. In terms of their involvement specifically in this plan, I think was more, we had like certain representatives of the community who sort of have their foot in both. We didn't interview specifically farmers for this one because it was a little bit more habitat and water focused. But I would say that our overall like pulse on that community in Chatham is pretty strong, and we do have a lot of farm owners in these areas that we work with strongly. And so TLC's position has never been to sort of keep farming out of things. It's more like how can we support local farmers and improve like their habitat buffers and maybe like, like best farming practices to help support water quality. And so I think our partnerships are more kind of come in at that angle. And we do have, if you look up this full plan, we do have layers for farms and food as part of it. I think it was just
Right.
less so in terms of actually speaking for the purposes of this plan. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. It shows. I mean, I know some of the farmers down there, and I know that they would be very excited about this work and, supportive. But there's a number of farmers that get left out,
Mhm.
in discussions like this, and they're very, they're obviously very, very concerned about habitat and, the supporting what they're doing. And this does support what they're doing in most cases. So I could see,
Yeah,
but I could also
absolutely.
see because of one reason or another, not being necessarily involved in this. So
It's hard. I think land trusts especially have been poor about including them and people sometimes in its mission. And so it's good to see TLC sort of taking a different approach to that. And I think just knowing how many farm projects we've done in the last year, that we're definitely like gaining ground in that community and sort of bringing people together. But I see your point for sure.
yeah, that's good.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Chloe. We can stop the recording, I think, and terrific. Really appreciate you sharing all that.